Hello, everybody. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, Ricardo Lopes, and today my guest is Dr. Michael Ruse. He is a philosopher of science who specializes in the philosophy of biology and works on the relationship between science and religion, the creation-evolution controversy, and the demarcation problem within science. He currently teaches at Florida State University, where he is Lucille T. Werkmeister Professor and Director of HPS program. He is also a very prolific writer, author of books like Darwinian Revolution, Darwin and Design, and more recently, On Purpose. So, Dr. Ruse, thank you a lot for accepting the invitation.
My pleasure.
Okay, good. So I guess that the first question I would ask you is, would you say that Darwinism was really an epistemological revolution that we had in science?
Well, the answer is yes, I would. Epistemological, I think I'd want to say it was more than just epistemological. It was it was revolutionary in just about every respect that one can think about. I mean, if one recognizes that one is not the special creation of a good God on the sixth day, 6,000 years ago, but that we're the end product of a long, slow, rather painful process of evolution, and our immediate ancestors were not today's apes, but certainly apes of some kind, I would say that that's a pretty big revolution epistemologically, morally, socially, religiously, any other way you want to think about. I mean, certainly, in literature and creatively, all of these things.
Mhm.
I mean, it's very hard to think of. Well, you think of some of the great love poetry like Shakespeare. Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Thou art more fair and lovely. Well, yes, except you're also a monkey, and what does that make of you? You're no longer some ethereal being made in the image of God, special, and all of these sorts of things. You're along with it, along part of the animal world, along with dogs and cats and mice and everything else. So yes, the answer to your question is it's about as big as you can get.
Yes, exactly. And I guess that even from a historical, philosophical perspective, Darwinian evolution really did overturn a lot of ideas that were prevalent, like, for example, the idea of purpose and final cause.
Well, yes, except my experience of revolutions is that they can be revolutionary without necessarily being completely new. I mean, the whole point about revolutions so often is that there's continuity, and it's rather like what in English we call a kaleidoscope, where you start off with certain pattern and you shake it and you get a different picture, but it's the same parts. And I'm always struck by the extent to which uh, the Darwinian revolution particularly, but I think you could probably also say the same of the Copernican revolution. I mean, the Copernican revolution was a great revolution, but Plato had already made the sun very important. So it wasn't exactly as if Copernicus was doing something which had never been thought of before. He was putting it in a very different context. And I would want to say the same with Darwin. I mean, I'm looking at you, and handsome young fellow that you are, I'm looking at you and I'm seeing those twinkly eyes, and I'm seeing those bright flashing teeth and that very masculine looking beard. Well, they don't just happen. They're there for a purpose. Obviously, what do you call them in Portugal? Not senoritas, but, I mean, the whole point is they're there in order that you can see, in order that you can smell, in order that you can chew, all of these sorts of things. And that was true before Darwin. And of course, it's true after Darwin. Now, the question is not whether your eyes are foreseeing, that they were foreseeing before Darwin was ever thought of, and they're foreseeing right now. The question is, how do we explain them? So, as I say, the revolution is not saying, oh, well, nobody's ever thought of these at all, or never thought of these as having any purpose before. Of course, the whole point is we have, and so often we know the purpose. Now the question is, how do we explain it if we're not going to explain it as, you know, God sat down with his drawing board and drew up a picture and said, yes, I think this looks pretty good for eyes. Let's draw in the retina like this and that sort of thing. And more than that, that God, you know, made some bad mistakes because everything was inverted. And God said, oops, made a big mistake there. Well, I better find some way of fixing it. Because the Darwinian says it's not a mistake in that sort of way. That's how it evolved, and nature had to get around it, and it did. So as I say, revolution, yes. But I always like to say about Darwin himself, he was a great revolutionary, but he was not a rebel. I mean, he was a very comfortable Englishman who had absolutely no doubts whatsoever that the English were far superior to anybody on the continent. And that went unchanged. The question is, how did he want to set about explaining this? And often, of course, his explanations undermined what he believed. I mean, clearly Darwin thought that the English were superior to the Portuguese, let alone the French and Germans. But now, of course, we look at it and say, well, we see why Darwin was arguing that, and we agree with Darwin's arguments, but maybe the conclusion isn't quite so straightforward, and that, in fact, we can see that alternative strategies might be just as good, and that, let's say, for instance, somebody with a dark skin might be just as well adapted to the kind of environment they live in, as opposed to, say, somebody like you with a light skin who's just as well adapted to the environment you live in. So whereas somebody like Darwin might have gone in and said, oh, well, and this proves the superiority of white skin over black skin, we want to say, yes, Darwin, we accept your explanation, but we don't necessarily accept your conclusion, and that your own explanation maybe undermines some of those very 19th century chauvinist views that you had not only about races, but particularly about women.
Mm-hmm. Yes, exactly. But about the concept of purpose, because I guess that it is very important to understand, I guess, how it was extricated from the biological process after Darwinian evolution, because I guess that there are many people that when they think about evolution, they associate it with some sort of progress, let's say, that it is sort of a theological process, that it improves over time, because some people look at us as humans, as Homo sapiens, as the pinnacle of evolution or something like that. But I want to ask you, do you think that even if evolution by itself as a process doesn't have any purpose, would you say that it imbued certain beings at least with purpose? So, for example, because us as humans, and this is just to give one example, because probably other animals also have this, we cognitively use purpose to create things. For example, we create new tools that serve certain purposes.
Well, I think I think you're asking a question which goes right to the heart of science. The whole point about science is it's not just give us the facts, give us a description. With science, it's a combination, and I mean, I don't think one has to be an out-and-out Kantian to agree with this, but it's certainly a combination of the world that we perceive and the world that we try to make sense of. Now, pretty clearly, if we humans are going to try to make sense of the world, we're going to use the tropes and metaphors and analogies that we use in everyday life. I mean, if we were, for instance, let's say codfish, presumably we think of the world in different perspectives, but we're humans, we are social beings, we are creative beings. I mean, the way that humans succeed in this world is, I mean, if you think about it, we're pretty thin-skinned. We're not very good at, I mean, if you put us out in the outside on our own, stark naked on our own, we wouldn't do very well. Whereas I suspect, let's say, a cat might do quite well indeed. But why is it that we're so successful? Well, because we're very good at not only socializing and passing on ideas, but also with doing things with the world and being creative and making things and that sort of thing. So clearly, we humans live in a world where of creation, of design. So I don't think it's at all surprising, therefore, that when we try to understand the world, we would use metaphors like design or progress, that we see that we've managed to, improve things, that, medical care or something like that, or communications. I mean, we couldn't have done this 50 years ago, for instance. And so I think it's natural to take those human items, as it were, and try to understand the world in terms of these. I mean, the simple fact is, if we don't do it that way, then what do we do? What do we do? So the point is, now, sometimes this works very well. And sometimes, for instance, looking at things for purpose makes a lot of sense. Although, as somebody like the late Stephen Jay Gould used to say, caveat emptor, that yes, purpose, but don't necessarily think that every last thing has a purpose. I mean, look at you. There you are, a handsome young man with a beard, and all the girls are attracted and they say, oh my goodness, look at Ricardo. Boy, hasn't he got a beard? I'd love to have his babies. And so we go on like that. But Stephen Jay Gould would say, but maybe there's no purpose. The fact is, you have a beard and girls don't have beards because that's the side effects of the hormones that led to you having a penis and them having a vagina. Having a penis does have a purpose, and it is essential. But having a beard may be just a side effect of the hormones necessary to create penises. And beards are, they just are. So, as I say, I'm not sure that Gould is right about this. I mean, I think one could obviously say a lot of things about beards and sexual selection and all of those sorts of things. But the point is, we're going to think in terms of things like purpose, because if we don't, then what do we do? Now, the interesting thing is, what we found is that thinking in terms of purpose when it comes to inanimate objects, let us say like the moon, isn't terribly helpful. I mean, back, in the old days, they would certainly have thought in terms of purpose. I mean, the moon exists to light the way home for drunken philosophers at the end of a long day. But now we'd say, well, that's a joke. Maybe drunken philosophers do use the moon, but the moon doesn't exist. The moon, what we'd be inclined to say now is the moon just is. The moon doesn't have a purpose. And of course, at another level, terrible as it is, we'd want to say, well, organisms just are. That's all there is to it. I mean, that what did Camus say? Life is absurd and there is no purpose. But at the same time, I think what we want to say is, yes, but at another level, thinking in terms of purpose about humans can be, and other organisms can be very, very valuable. And it can serve a great, a very important role. And obviously, I mean, if I ask, what's that thing sticking out on the front of your face? I mean, it's a nose. What's its purpose? Well, it's one of the senses. What's the purpose of having the senses? So you can find your way around the world, so you can manipulate it, so you can use it, and all of these things. So, yes, I mean, but as I say, without being out and out pragmatist, I do see science very much as a sort of a Kantian interplay between the given and the interpreted, as it were.
Mm-hmm.
But
Exactly.
I don't see that as particularly contentious. I don't see that as, you know, something which is very radical, particularly, you know, 200 years after Kant.
Okay, fair enough. And could you please give us a brief overview about how, let's say, the modern synthesis of evolution works? Because I guess that since Darwin, and most people associate natural evolution, natural selection with Darwin, of course, because he was one of the originators of the idea, and he published on the origin of species 160 years ago or something like that. But since Darwin, the concept and what we include in the process of evolution has itself evolved quite a lot, correct?
Yeah. Yes. Well, as I see it, I mean, the important thing about Darwin's theory, and I would include natural selection right in this, evolution through natural selection, which of course is what Darwin always did. I would say that this is, I mean, if I say it's a metaphysical picture, that's in no sense to deny that it's a scientific picture, but it certainly functions as a kind of overall metaphysical picture rather as the Christian creationism picture functioned. I mean, if you asked a Christian, let's say back in the medieval times, how do you explain the world? They'd have said, well, it's the creation of a good God who necessarily exists, but who created out of love, who created the world, who created the world as a habitat for organisms, for animals and plants, who created animals right up to humans, but who then created humans who are, in some sense, distinctively special because they uniquely are made in the image of God. And of course, then Christians want to add on things like the fall and why we're not perfect now and all sorts of issues like that. But I mean, that's basically what you've got with the Christian overall picture. Now, what I see Darwin as doing, and I do want to say, I don't see Darwin necessarily as denying God or even the Christian God, but I do see Darwin as offering a naturalistic picture to rival that supernatural picture of Christianity. That what Darwin is saying, that, you know, at some point the world exists. I mean, Darwin, I don't think is talking about whether or not there was eternal existence or whether there was anything. I mean, Darwin didn't even know about the Big Bang, but I don't think today's Darwinians would say, well, everything depends on whether or not there was something before the Big Bang or anything like that. I mean, you know, that's not part of the story. But what they are saying is for 4.5 billion years ago, you'd got this planet which started to cool down. And then at some point, life appeared on it, whether life was brought from elsewhere or, as I think most would want to say, life started. I mean, it's not spontaneous generation in the sense of now you've got nothing and now you've got worms, but that at some gradual level, the complex molecules, the DNA molecules, and the RNA, nowadays, of course, they think that RNA was before DNA, but that these complex molecules started to appear and self-replicate. And then over the course of 3 billion years, evolution did develop. I mean, and obviously, if you want to use words like progress, it's difficult not to, isn't it? Because clearly, in any sense of talking about complexity or anything like that, obviously, you've got some kind of progress going on. I mean, that's just, you know, I mean, that's just silly to say that the eukaryotic cell is not at some level not only more complex than the simple prokaryotic cell, but that it's a lot more powerful and it can do things that eukaryotes can do, things that prokaryotes can't. So, and then obviously over the years you've got the development of sophisticated plants, and at the same time flowering plants and these sorts of things, and at the same time you had the development, and let's be honest about it, of ever more sophisticated organ animals. I mean, animals that can live on land, animals that can fly, animals that can return to the water and live in the water, all of these things. And I mean, clearly with this, we get the related development of intelligence. And I don't think any evolutionist today would be like Descartes and say animals don't think or animals don't have consciousness. I think any evolutionist today would say, well, of course they do. It may not be the level of consciousness that we have, but anybody who's had a dog, for instance, knows full well that they're not just a falling stone, and that dogs at various levels can show emotions. They can, you know perfectly well when they know perfectly well when they've done something they shouldn't have done, or they're perfectly well, you know, when they're pleased or when they're happy to see you, or when they're feeling a bit depressed, all of these sorts of things, when they're in pain. So clearly we go all the way from there up to humans. So obviously what Darwinism wants to say is that the theory of evolution through natural selection is tremendously powerful, because as the Christian story of creation gives us a story which explains all sorts of different things, so likewise one's going to have the story of Darwinism, which is also going to explain things. Now, I don't want to speak for the creationists, but if you ask them, say, things, certainly the cruder, you know, how do you explain the distribution of animals and plants on the Galapagos, or let's say the Azores, to, you know, to get close to home for you? They presumably a creationist would start talking in terms of Noah's flood and things like this. And of course, these days they talk in terms of kinds, and they might well say, well, you know, certain kinds ended up in Portugal and then they went off to the Azores. And, you know, of course, creationists today would even say they might have evolved when they got to the Azores or something like that, although much faster than evolutionists think. So you've got these rival pictures, whereas, of course, Darwinians want to say, well, if you look at the flora and fauna of the Azores, why is it a hell of a lot more like Portugal than it is, let's say, than like Bolivia, or let's say like Ecuador? Why are the plants and animals of the Azores like Portugal, and why are the plants and animals of the Galapagos like Ecuador? And why not the other way around? So, of course, the Darwinian wants to explain these in terms of natural, you know, geographical distributions. And Darwin has a lot of discussion about how plants or seeds can do long, you know, trips across the ocean when they're embedded in driftwood. And, you know, he ran experiments to show that, and all of these sorts of things. So I would want to say that what we've got today is very much a sort of functioning paradigm, to use Thomas Kuhn's sense. Of course, I think what's interesting today, as opposed to Darwin, is that we're aware that natural selection can work much more quickly than Darwin thought. I think Darwin never really thought, for instance, that we would see natural selection in our lifetime, or that it was possible to do that sort of thing. Whereas now, of course, evolutionists would say, yes, I mean, let's take something like lactose intolerance. Very few Chinese, for instance, I mean, if you've had a Chinese student and you offer them a milkshake, they'll probably say, no, I can't digest it. Whereas if you go to Ireland, for instance, and offer an Irishman a milkshake, he would just drink it without thinking about it. Now, why is that? Because the Irish have got genes for lactose tolerance, and the Chinese don't. Now, we know now that lactose tolerance, of course, is a very good adaptation. It means that you can take advantage of animal milks, and dairy farming makes sense. Whereas, you know, it basically doesn't for the Chinese. I mean, they might grow animals for meat, but growing them for milk is pointless because they can't digest it, at least not as adults. So we know now that, in fact, lactose tolerance is something which followed the development of modern agriculture, so we're talking in terms of the last 10,000 years. So we know that something like lactose tolerance is something that evolved very rapidly, maybe in 2 or 3,000 years, because there was such an advantage. All the little Lopeses who could drink milk did so much better than all the little Haifongs who couldn't drink milk. And so in the next generation, there's half a dozen little Lopeses and maybe only one Haifong, and this is how it goes. And so consequently, Portugal is full of Lopeses and Haifongs don't exist. Whereas if you go to China, Lopeses, don't do very well. And, they got to Macau, but not much more than that. And the Chinese are doing very well. So it's all very much, but of course, this again impinges on notions of progress. So you, as it were, you come back, you might enter with all these views about progress, but as the theory develops, you realize that you've got to be a great deal more cautious about talking about things like this, and that being Portuguese is not necessarily in itself better than being Chinese. It's different strokes for different folks, and that maybe living in Portugal, it's better off overall to be Portuguese rather than Chinese. Now, that is not an argument against immigrants, because obviously, Chinese people live very comfortably in North America, and they don't necessarily eat the same things that we do. But then, of course, there's a lot of overlap, and we all, I, for instance, love to eat sushi. And by and large, there is sometimes some cream cheese in sushi, but by and large, it's not something where lactose tolerance is a major issue. So as I say, I think there's all of these sorts of factors come in. So what I'd want to, Theodosius Dobzhansky used to say, nothing makes sense except in the light of evolution. I'm inclined to broaden it and say nothing makes sense, period, except in the light of evolution. I think, if I might go on for a minute, I think what is so interesting is the extent to which my fellow philosophers, Anglophone philosophers, and not just have had so much difficulty accepting this. I like to think of philosophers as intelligent people at the cutting edge of thought. But it turns out that an awful lot of philosophers are really pretty pre-Darwinian. They like the idea of humans being special. And, their whole philosophy, whether it was Plato or Aristotle or Descartes, Descartes particularly, or Kant, all of their philosophy has been predicated on a good Christian belief. We may not be made in the image of God, although a lot of them think so, but we are as if we were made in the image of God. We humans uniquely are special. We're rational. We're this, we're that, we're the other, and we've escaped our animal origins, if indeed we ever had them. And I think it's really fascinating today is how many eminent philosophers find it very difficult to accept the Darwinian revolution. Oh, yes, they'd say we accept evolution, although often they're not very keen on Darwinism, but they certainly don't want to introduce it into their philosophy.
Mm-hmm. Very well. And at a certain point there you referred to something that I guess we can call nowadays culture gene coevolution or dual inheritance theory when you refer to lactose intolerance or intolerance. I guess it depends on what exactly we're talking about. So what I want to ask you is that nowadays, apart from purely genetic evolution, because at a certain point in our evolutionary history, we gathered all the cognitive tools that we needed in order to create culture and accumulate it over time, then we also have to consider the effects that cultural evolution might have.
At one level, I want to say, I don't find gene culture evolution a particularly troublesome notion. It's very complex, or a particularly threatening notion. It seems to me obvious that humans have developed culture. A culture is a very powerful adaptation. I don't see any reason why necessarily that means that everything we do all of the time necessarily has to be tied into evolution. once again, I look at you, and I mean, obviously, the way that you're combing your hair, or the fact that you're wearing an open neck T-shirt rather than a tie. Let's take that. When I grew up, everybody wore ties, and most people wore hats. I don't know when you last wore a hat. I mean, I put on something when it's cold, a toque or something. But normally I would never dream of putting on a hat. And as for wearing a tie, I think I've got one. But I don't think necessarily that has a great deal to do with the genes or anything like that. So I do think that I think an awful lot. What I think is interesting is the extent to which, nevertheless, as Ed Wilson used to say, the string tugs back, that even when you think that you're farthest from the genes, they have a nasty way of coming back. Let's take the whole contentious issue of feminism. Now, I mean, at one level, one has to have an awful lot of empathy for feminists, because there's no question that Darwin, I mean, women have been put down unnecessarily. When I started university, women were certainly less than 1 in 3. Now, I expect it's the same in Portugal, certainly with undergraduates. You know perfectly well, women are usually 2 in 3. I mean, the problem at universities now is not women, it's men. Why the hell aren't men at university? What the hell are they going to do with the rest of their lives? Are they just going to sweep roads while their wives are school teachers and doctors and all of these things? So, as you know, clearly an awful lot of this was just social pressure. On the other hand, I think it's stupid, really stupid, to think that that means that culture is all important when it comes to male-female differences. I mean, I think we're finding, for instance, and I'm sure you've got friends or whatever, women who hit their 30s and they're completely independent and all of that, and then they get 32, 33, and suddenly they're looking for mates because they want to have kids. Now, men can put it off until their 40s because, I mean, I started a second family when I was 46 and went on to 52, and only stopped then because I was getting worn out. My wife who was much younger, would have been happy to keep going. But the point is I could do that. Whereas my first wife, by the time I was having my second family, my first wife was into a menopause. So, although she remarried, there was no more kids coming her way. Now, the point I'm making is, I mean, I've got a graduate student right here at the moment who's courting a girlfriend who's 36, who's, for 15 years has had a succession of boyfriends, but now is very serious because she wants a family. So what I'm saying is, it seems to me perfectly natural. I mean, obviously at one level it's cultural, but at another level it's obviously biological. She's a human being. She wants to have a family. She's not just a human being. She's a female human being. Her biology not only puts certain constraints on her, but her biology also, thanks to her hormones, fills her with certain desires and issues and these sorts of things. I mean, is it more important for women to have children than for men? I'm not sure. I mean, I love having kids, but if somebody were able to show me, there's real evidence to suggest that, I wouldn't find it surprising or in any sense threatening. I mean, I wouldn't say that makes women inferior or anything like that. I mean, frankly, in many respects, if I were injured in a hospital, I'd much sooner have a female nurse. I'm not saying I wouldn't, a nice young gay nurse or something wouldn't be fine, but you know what I mean. So what I'm saying is, I think that often the biology culture interface is a lot more complex than our ideologies will let us believe. And I would even go so far as to say, I don't necessarily find that necessarily at the risk of getting myself into a lot of hot water, of saying that maybe in some respects men are better suited for STEM things than women. I mean, you've got to be careful about this. It's stupid. I mean, we all know women who are very good engineers, who are really good mathematicians, just as we all know men who are very good at writing, at doing literary things. I mean, in many respects, I would say I've got much more of a feminine side when it comes to intellectual things than I do a masculine side. I don't think it's all one and not the other, but there's no question but that when I'm writing, I feel that I have a really good sensitivity about human nature, which at some level one, for better or for worse, often, says to women, well, they're the ones who really understand, how people are feeling or something like that. Men are so concerned. And I've often felt that one of my real strengths is that I do have a good sense of what it might have been like to be, let's say, Alfred Russel Wallace or even Darwin, in a way that is very important. Now, is this masculine, is this feminine? I don't really care that much. Whereas there's no question, I wasn't bad at mathematics and these things, but I certainly don't have that male urge to go out into nature or to build bridges or something like that. I mean, which we tend to associate with Isambard Kingdom Brunel or something like that. So clearly it's a lot more complex than that. But at the same time, anybody who's done any biology whatsoever knows that simply to say, well, it's all culture and biology has nothing to do with it, they're wrong. If there's anything you can say to start with, they're wrong. I mean, I look at you and I've never seen such a melange of, on the one hand, of culture. You speak European languages, for instance. You dress like a European. You comb your hair in a 20th century way, these sorts of things. You dress like somebody in the 21st century rather than somebody in the middle of the 20th century. So at one level, it's so clearly cultural. But at another level, look at you. You're a walking selfish gene. I mean, all you want to do is walk down the road and say, I'm Ricardo Lopez and I've got big testicles, have my babies. Sorry, Ricardo, you're probably gay. And you're thinking, well, it's very nice to say this about me, but it doesn't apply. But anyhow.
No, do not worry about that at all. but since
you've got to tell me you're on your fourth wife now and have 15 children.
No, let's not get into my personal life here. But anyway, since you referred to the selfish gene when you were finishing your exposition, let's say, about human nature and human behavior and the masculine and the feminine and things like that. So I guess that nowadays still we have this issue about what is the proper unit of selection that we should consider to be the target of natural selection, because there are people who talk about the gene itself, there are people who talk about the individual, the kin, there are even people that talk about the group and about group selection. Right. So what do you think?
That's a very interesting question, particularly since, as you may know, the English female philosopher Mary Midgley died about 10 days ago. And Mary Midgley was somebody who hated the selfish gene, hated everything that Dawkins said, and was very much into group selection and Gaia and a group thing like that. And there's no question that particularly amongst philosophers, there tends to be a hatred of selfish genes and a feeling that we've got to be much more holistic and Gaia-like, you don't understand when I say Gaia, the world as an organism and these sorts of things. Well, I hate to point out that the biggest holists of the 20th century were the National Socialists. Ein Volk, Ein Reich, Ein Führer. You can't get much more holistic than that. So I've always been very dubious about holism. I mean, I'm not against holism, but I don't automatically see holism good, reductionism bad, because I think the story is a lot more complex than that. The fact is, I think that purely at the scientific level, there's an awful lot to be said for selfish genes. Now, I mean, it's a metaphor. And although even Dawkins, perhaps especially Dawkins, tends to think that selfish genes means selfish human beings, it just doesn't. It simply doesn't. It's a metaphor which says that by and large, the smaller units are going to win out over the bigger units because they work more quickly, more effectively, more at the coalface. That yes, there can well be big advantages for group cooperation. The trouble is, by the time you get to group cooperation, individual selfishness has won out. I mean, goodness, don't we see this in America at the moment? I mean, we know that there's global warming. We know that America should, as a whole, get together and do something about it, that they should cut down on fuel use, artificial fuel use, that they should get into sunshine. I mean, I live in Florida, for Christ's sakes, the Sunshine State, and we don't have any solar panels anywhere. I mean, we know that we should be doing this, but we see that what's happening is the selfish items of people like Trump and his acolytes in Congress like Mitch McConnell are all going for the immediate payoff. How can we make money? How can we dig out the coal or the fuel and sell it and make money now? And the trouble is, selfishness tends to trump, if I could use such a word, altruism. So, I mean, the point is, I don't see this as an ideological thing. I see this basically about as close to a scientific fact as you can get. And I think, by and large, almost every practicing evolutionary biologist would agree with me that, in fact, selfishness at that level, understanding that we're not talking about human selfishness, but that individual selection really does trump group selection. Now, it doesn't mean that on occasion group selection can't work, and it certainly doesn't mean individual selfishness, because, I mean, to start with, reciprocal altruism, you scratch my back and I scratch yours, makes perfectly good sense. I mean, look, why am I, taking time out to talk to you right now, a total stranger? Is it because I'm Jesus Christ on earth? No. It's because that's the way. No, I'm a senior academic, and that's the way that senior academics work. When a junior academic comes and says, do something for me, by and large, I say, of course I will, because people did that for me earlier. But of course, Ricardo, I expect in 20 or 30 years' time, when you're, professor of the, chancellor of the whole of Lisbon University or something, and some little squirt from Tallahassee comes along and says, Herr Doctor, Professor, Holiness, Your Holiness Lopez, would you mind if I did an interview with you? You're going to say, well, it'll be a bit tight, but I can do it on Friday morning if you'd like to do that. And you do exactly what I'm doing. Again, not because maybe you are Jesus Christ. I mean, you look a little bit like him, but you need the bed sheets and everything like that. But no, I mean, it's because that's the way that humans work. And of course, the point is, Ricardo, we work very well because of that. I mean, that's the whole point, isn't it? That you're not. I mean, we know people who are selfish. And we say, yes, well, there's always going to be people like that. But by and large, we all get on so much better if we're prepared to give a hand. We know perfectly well that if we're prepared to do our bit and not cheat too badly on our taxes, but do these sorts of things, we know not only will we be, biology has made us this way, but we know that our society will work better, and it means that we will do better, and those 15 children and 4 wives that you've got will also do better. So, it pays off, doesn't it? Wife number 3 doesn't come to you and say, oh, Ricardo, I just can't manage. Number 3 will come and say, do you know, there was this awfully nice person who was really decent to me, and, if you could ever do them a favor, I'd really appreciate it.
Yeah, yeah, exactly.
I'm not used to talking to people with 4 wives and 15 children.
You're already inventing completely my personal history.
Well, you're being very private about it, so I'm beginning to wonder.
Yeah, I guess that I prefer sticking to the intellectual conversation instead of
Yeah, I'm
talking
beginning to
about...
think you're one of those Muslims which was left over from the invasion of Iberia way back when. But go on.
Oh, the Moors
That's right. Yeah, yeah.
that
Yeah,
Afonso Henriques
you have a bit of an Islam look about you.
Okay. I don't know anything about my ancestry, my genetic ancestry, so I don't know what to say about that. Okay, so but now a very specific thing that I would like to address with you today, that is the concept of species, because I mean. Nowadays, particularly since we already know that, for example, there are horizontal transmission of genes sometimes between species, and even, for example, species that are part of different realms, for example, viruses that insert, for some reason or another, genetic material into cells that are part of the germline. And then that genetic material then becomes part, let's say, of that species that was infected. So, I mean, what can we say about the concept of species nowadays?
And are you worried then about improving species through gene manipulation? Is that what you're thinking about? Is this the end point of your discussion, or what?
No, I'm just asking perhaps how is the concept of species defined nowadays?
Well, I think I don't know that it's defined really very much other than it used to be. I mean, by and large, what people want to say is that species are, genetically intra-reproducing groups, which are, inter non-reproducing and non-fertile. So we'd want to say that humans are a species separate, let's say, from chimpanzees, because, despite all the science fiction, humans and chimpanzees cannot, and by and large do not want to interbreed, whereas, as we know, pretty much all humans can indeed interbreed. And if we took you off to search of that 5th wife, and we took you off to a Polynesian island or something like that, that by and large we'd expect that you would be able to interbreed when you found yourself there. Or if we took you down to Terra del Fuego or whatever it is, I mean, if we took you on a breeding trip, which, from what I gather from your private life you'd really enjoy, and we took you to 10 different places, I mean, by and large, there's no reason why there shouldn't be 10, little Lopez's spread, or what's the plural of Lopez? Lopi, spread around the world. So the point is that we are, species. Now, we know perfectly well that this doesn't always work, that there are, obviously, when there's species in the making, you're going to find borderline cases. And we know that particularly in plants, we get a lot of issues to do with hybridism and that sort of thing. But again, any Darwinian would tell you, well, I would be surprised if there weren't. And particularly if you're a Darwinian, you're going to expect borderline cases. Or there's no question that maybe when you get down to micro levels, interbreeding isn't necessarily the best thing, that one would do it by various morphological features or just simply that they don't. But as I say, I don't find any of that particularly troublesome. Of course, the big issue is sort of within the species and to what extent there is variation. And as you know, particularly after the Second World War, with all the racism, of the National Socialists, there was, with people like Ashley Montagu, were arguing very strongly against racial notions and wanting to say basically there's no such thing as race, there's no such thing as subspecies in humans. And of course, people like Richard Lewontin said there's far more variation within a population like, say, the Portuguese than there is, say, between the Portuguese and, where should we say, some place where the Portuguese didn't go, out to Mongolia or something like that. And of course, now we know that that's way exaggerated, that although it would be, nobody wants to talk, too bluntly in terms of subspecies, there clearly are certain levels, terms which, if it weren't humans, we would use subspecies sort of languages, let's say Scandinavians and people from the Congo or something like that. But more than that, of course, we also know that there's an awful lot of evidence of related genetic differences between populations. And some of the studies that they've done across the world have been able to show that there are, in fact, fairly significant, as I say, and identifiable genetic differences. And of course, we're recognizing that knowing this is not necessarily a bad thing. I mean, for instance, I live in Florida, where there's a lot of black people, and we know that black people are much more prone to prostate cancer than white people. And when I see in the paper, sometimes you'll see our local urologists putting out a call for men to go and have prostate screening. And one of the things they always say is that this is particularly important for African Americans. Now, are they being racially biased in saying this, or are they being good doctors in saying this? Surely all of us would want to say they're being good doctors in saying this, because they know that the chances of an African American developing prostate cancer are, let's say, 2 to 1 over white people. So they've got a moral obligation to say this, and not to take note of things like this is just stupid. So, as I say, I think we're now recognizing that racial things and medicine are a lot more complex, and that we have to be a great deal more subtle and careful in dealing with these things. And I would hope to see, a lot of the talk about at educational levels, a lot more serious discussion about male-female abilities, or maybe even, everybody says as soon as you start asking about black-white abilities, you're making, Negroes are fond of rhythm and that sort of thing. And of course, the trouble is there's an awful lot of that. But and maybe this is not a time that we can do it. But at the same time, the thing is, we're already into this. Certainly in North America, if a white girl came home and said to her parents, I'm dating a black man, the parents would say, oh, dear God, don't tell anybody. But if she came home and said, I'm dating a Chinese, their first thoughts would be, let's get the grandchildren down for Harvard as soon as we can. Because everybody thinks that the Chinese are brighter than Caucasians, So you know how it works. So it's going on, whether you like it or not. Now, of course, there are other issues like, with new gene techniques, can we make for superhumans? By and large, I think that's pie in the sky. I think much more important, and I think most people would agree, is can we make for, people who are not handicapped? And anybody who says, oh, well, we shouldn't do these sorts of things because you're going to be prejudiced against Down syndrome children, I just think they're wrong. I think anybody who says deliberately, I want to have a Down syndrome child rather than a normal child, is sick. They're sick. Of course any parent, if you say, well, I'm having a baby, and you say, is it a boy or is it a girl? The first thing any parent is going to say, it's much more important for me that they be healthy rather than, I don't mind if I have a boy or a girl. And I expect of your 15 children, you felt exactly the same way. And you said to your wives, well, we've already got 8 boys. Maybe it would be nice to have a girl. But frankly, as far as I'm concerned, it's much more important for us to have a healthy baby rather than a sick one.